So here's a question for you. Do you need to learn grammar when you're trying to learn English? Now, before we can answer this question, there are several things that we need to think about. And the first comparison I want to make is one to your first language. Now, this might seem difficult. Why would you look at your first language while we're trying to talk about our second language? But I think there is some evidence in looking at our first language first. Because this has been a debate that has been going on in language learning research and linguistics research for as long as research has been tracked, I think. And this is one of those issues that just simply hasn't been solved yet. Now, I'm not saying that I can solve it at the moment, but I just want to point out what is my opinion. What do I think? And do we actually need to learn grammar when we're trying to learn English? And is there a difference for beginners or more advanced learners? And if we look at grammar, what do we need to look at when you're studying your grammar? So let's make this comparison between our first language and our second language. Because if you think of your time as a baby, which you probably don't remember a lot of, you know that you don't learn a language as a baby by studying grammar books. One of the things they did do is that they talked to you. They simply exposed you to the language that you're learning, your first language. So a baby is always exposed to their first language because there are parents around them, there's a television on, there's a radio on, other people try to talk to this baby. And even though the baby doesn't really recognize everything at the beginning, he or she does know what's going on. They recognize that someone is talking to them and they make eye contact. And one of the key elements of this exposure to the language is something that we call motherese, which is this language we use when we talk to babies. So we say things like pookie, 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 and you're such a cute baby, aren't you? And bugu, bugu, bugu. Lots of those weird sounds that we make towards babies when we talk to them. So when we want to answer the question, how do you learn a first language? We always say that these children are exposed to their first language. And even children who are not exposed to their first language, feral children, end up learning the language rather quickly. Now, there is something in first language acquisition that we call the critical period, after which learning a language becomes very difficult, but not impossible, as these feral children have already proven. Now, one of the first things that we can easily track and measure when we're talking about first language acquisition is the use of vocabulary. And we go from around one word around our 12th month to 50,000 words when we're 18. And this is all still in our first language. Now, the question we need to ask ourselves when we talk about first language acquisition is, when do we start talking about grammar? Because grammar is considered this very important thing that we need to learn when we're learning a language. So when we look at all of this and we see how children learn their first languages, we see that we start with some sounds, they start to learn something about vocabulary, they build their words, they start producing complex sentences at some point, but there's no grammar yet. So even though that they've been exposed to the language for 60 months and they produce basically some words, some mummies and daddies, some multi-word utterances, there is no grammar. There's still nobody who sits down with children and says, it's now time to learn about the present simple. It's now time to learn about present continuous. And let's look at conditionals while we're at it. Oh, and by the way, it would be good if you can create passive sentences as well. Now, one of the interesting things that one of the renowned scientists, Ellis, said is that we store language in a warehouse of constructions. And that's how we should see language in our brain. And when we're trying to use language, we need to get stuff from that warehouse of constructions. And we save language in chunks and CWOSTS, which are conventionalized ways of saying things. An example of a CWOST is in English. When somebody dies and somebody passes away and they tell you about that, you automatically tend to say, I'm sorry to hear that. And in other languages like Dutch, we don't have this I'm sorry to hear that phrase, but I know that when I'm speaking to somebody in English and I want to express my sympathy, I can say, I'm sorry to hear that. And this is one of those things that is stored in my warehouse of constructions together with the CWOST, I'm sorry to hear that. So when it comes to first language acquisition, we focus on vocabulary, on chunks, on CWOSTs, and things that belong together, and we laugh when children make mistakes because it shows that they're learning something. But when it comes to second language acquisition, we focus on grammar, and specifically on the tenses and the conditionals and passives and lots of other grammatical constructions, and we explain all the rules. But again, we've seen that that's not the way we learn a first language. So we know now that grammar is actually not the best way to learn a language, but what is the best way to learn a second language or even a first language? Well, based on what we've seen, based on what I've told you about first language acquisition, we can basically conclude that everything that exposes you to a second language is the best way to learn this second language. And when we're learning a second language, there are two things that we need to have in there. Exposure, which you can get by watching Netflix and reading books and listening to podcasts, and of course following me here on YouTube by subscribing and turning on the notification bell, but also something called interaction, which means that we need to interact with the materials that we're being exposed to. And that means that one of the best ways to learn English is by simply gaming. Gaming is the best way and the most efficient way to learn a language. Because when you're gaming, and especially when you're playing an online multiplayer game, you're exposed to the language because the game might be in English, you might be listening to others who are also playing the game in English, and you're interacting. Because based on what you see and based on what you learn while you're gaming, you need to make certain decisions and do certain actions, and those actions have consequences. Now, there's more on why gaming is the best way to learn in English in the link in the description, but for now just remember that when you're gaming, you have the best combination of exposure and interaction to your second language. So does that mean that there's no place for language at all in second language acquisition? No. We can always talk about grammar. But the difficult thing with grammar is that when we talk about very minor grammatical issues, we don't focus on the bigger picture. We don't focus on the CWOSTS or the chunks in which those things appear. We only focus on the context maybe and what it means in that context, but we're still focusing on those individual elements. And if we're teaching grammar and we're explaining all the grammar rules, all the learners get what we call meta-linguistic knowledge, which is knowledge about the language and not something with the language or in the language. Now, this might be very interesting, especially if you're somebody who loves languages. But when you're trying to learn language because you're becoming a stewardess on a plane, or when you work at the bank and you need to operate lots and lots of sums of money, then you don't need to know when present simple is used, and then you don't need to know when these particular constructions are used in this particular context, but only if this exception appears. Meta-linguistic knowledge is only useful in some cases, and not all of them. And especially when you're a beginner, you don't want to focus on those meta-linguistic elements. You want to focus on communication, being fluent, and understanding as much as possible in a short amount of time. So instead of focusing on those very small elements and meta-linguistic knowledge, you want to focus on chunks, on CWOSTS, and on vocabulary. Because as a beginner, if you don't have the right amount of vocabulary and you're unable to understand what you're actually reading or listening to, language learning becomes very difficult. So focus on chunks, focus on the CWOSTS, and focus on vocabulary, and use, if necessary or if applicable, subtitles. Because those make it easier for you to understand things, and they make a clear link between your first language and your second language. This is why when people ask me what do I need to listen to as a beginner, I tell them find stories that you're familiar with. If you're familiar with Harry Potter in your native language, try watching the films in English or try reading the books in English. Because you already are familiar with the content, you don't need to focus on what happens, you know what happens in the story, and you can focus on the language. Now, switching from grammar to focusing on exposure is difficult, because you need to find the right exposure, you need to find the right level of the exposure, and you need to find something that's not too difficult and that's interesting at the same time. And when you get to the point that your written language contains lots of mistakes that impede intelligibility, which means that the person who's reading your work doesn't understand what you're saying, you might want to look at grammar. You might want to look at the word order in English and sometimes even at the tenses. But grammar is only a tool on your way to becoming a fluent English speaker, or English writer, or English user. So, study topics that make you a better language writer or speaker, and focus on the communicative use of language. Now, if you're someone who enjoys knowing all the rules, Practical English Usage by Swan is definitely the book for you to buy, because it's practical and it has all the rules that, general English use requires. So, do we need to learn grammar when we're trying to learn English? It basically depends. As a beginner, I wouldn't say so. As a more advanced learner, as someone who's trying to be accurate in writing and speaking, you might want to look at grammar. But again, Grammar is only a tool, it's not the outcome. If you found this video useful, please consider giving it a thumbs up. What are your thoughts? Have you learned English by studying grammar, or did you study your game, or did you watch something on Netflix, or did you binge Harry Potter? And did that make you a very good language user? For now, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in one of my next videos.